Hi everyone, good afternoon. I'll be talking about ocean fronts today and how that structures the marine life. So, there's a quick snap of the satellite, because that's what I'll be talking about. But for those not familiar with ocean fronts, here's a very obvious one that actually divides two oceans. But the idea is still the same, is that there's a horizontal change in properties like temperature or salinity or density, sometimes colour, as in this example. And these mixing zones in the ocean can be very important for extra nutrients, extra productivity of animals. So I won't go into the physics of what happens at the front. That's not what the room wants today, but just to let you know that there is extra mixing, turbulent processes that draw up nutrients, and it's important to know that it's a convergent area. Does this work? Yeah. No, not really. Where it accumulates floating things like plankton, plastics as well. But yes, this makes it a hotspot for various types of marine life. And what I'll do today is go through various examples of how fronts have impacted on marine life distributions. Not necessarily from last year, but I'll try and add in a bit about last year as well. Bob asked me to talk today to focus on those interactions, because fronts are a hotspot of interactions between different trophic levels and different species. So how we detect them is using satellite sea surface temperature. Here's a couple of examples, north of Scotland. So the fronts are shown in those black lines. We can detect those quite reliably from snapshots like this, and then combine them in terms of their gradients in temperature and how persistent they are, and then get rid of the temperatures and then just look at where the fronts are. So these darker lines show a whole variety of ocean fronts, and if instead you just looked at the temperatures, you'd miss out on these potentially interesting zones for marine life, where a small change in temperature might actually be a persistent structure that causes extra nutrients, maybe a longer growing season where after the spring bloom the nutrients have been depleted in most areas, but at the frontal zones that can persist with the productivity for longer in the year. So what I've done with these over the quite many years now, I've been doing this, is to propose and develop different tools for how we can apply this to marine ecology. So the first thing I did was to look at the long-term distribution of ocean fronts. This is a frequency over 10 years, and this fed into the Marine Protected Area programme for the UK, and in particular those two white areas were selected on the basis of their front distribution that then captures the distribution of mobile animals like dolphins and sharks, seabirds. So other things I can do is to simplify that spaghetti into more like a weather map, but for the ocean. So you can see the lines here, it's red on the warm side, blue on the cold side, and that helps us explain the fronts in terms of how far away from the front you are. So that's a useful parameter for ecology. Also how strong the fronts are and what side of the front you're on, the warm or the cold side. So I've applied those to various collaborations with ecology. And also looking globally, we can get this kind of information. Is that moving? No, it's not moving anymore. Never mind. So yeah, we can do all of this over a wide area. I wanted to give a quick plug for the Marine Vertebrates group at the University of Plymouth that I've collaborated with through various PhD projects, and they do a lot of good work. Claire Embling and Simon Ingram leading on that work. And yeah, some of the work I show has benefited from that. So one study, I'm not sure if it's going to work now. I might need to start that again. The basking sharks are known to follow fronts. So we did a nice study with David Sims and others, and my PhD students, Kylie, and the result was that the modelling suggested that, yes, indeed, thermal fronts is a major predictor of their presence, because they know that if they open their mouths along a temperature gradient, they're going to find more zooplankton. So that's their simplistic feeding strategy. Other animals use more complicated information, but still fronts are important to them, such as gannets are found to forage more frequently along persistent fronts. We didn't find a relationship with simultaneous fronts like we did for the sharks, but looking over a longer time series, there's a kind of a learnt behaviour that certain zones are more productive in different times of the year. But yeah, what's interesting is that their dive shape, if they know there's going to be food there, they do a shorter dive called a V dive, down and up again. But if they don't know they're going to find food, then they do a longer U-shaped dive. So where there's fronts around, they're doing more V-shaped dives. Similarly, dolphins, as Duncan suggested, there's some connections with dolphins. We've looked at kind of CPOD data and found that there's connections both in terms of the distance away and the strength of the fronts. Fronts around upwelling zones, like here around the southwest, and tidal mixing fronts, like between the Irish Sea and the Celtic Sea. I've missed out this one because I've not got time. The front analysis has contributed to various areas of policy, not just the UK marine protected areas, but also on sighting for offshore winds and looking at distributions of other animals when planning offshore developments, such as offshore energy and marine protected areas, and on the other side of the world as well. Previously, there were some efforts to denote ecologically and biologically significant areas, and now I'm pleased that with the High Seas Treaty that there's now a push for protecting 30% of the high seas, so I hope to be involved in that kind of guidance using ocean fronts. One of the ways we're doing that for conservation, this one is with an Australian project, is looking at reducing bycatch by studying fronts as one of the reasons why fish and target conservation animals should be in a particular area, and then setting up dynamic zones to avoid with that. So if we feed in our ocean fronts like that, then that can identify some of these predictive features. So that's one work that's ongoing. And then we have this European Space Agency project here at PML called BOOMS, and that's looking at more widely the structuring of biodiversity in the open ocean. And what we're doing with that is trying to develop seascapes that explain this dynamic feature space that different types of animals and different trophic levels respond to. So we started just looking at the optics from ocean colour to get this kind of first optical water types approach. But now with the second generation feeding and front maps, we're getting this kind of biophysical information about the ocean, and then this will feed into explaining, hopefully, the distributions of phytoplankton, zooplankton, fisheries, and then top predators. So that's interesting work that we're doing. And then the final piece of the puzzle is climate change. I'm often asked, well, do these fronts stay still, or are they going to develop with climate change? So we have the models, physical models and biological models, and we can run those ahead for the next century. And if I take the temperature, then I can generate a front map just in the same way, but it's now a hypothetical mid-century front map. And yeah, I could do that from chlorophyll as well. And that gives us metrics for those fronts. And then we can look at anomalies for changes based difference according to a baseline. So yeah, the blue and the red areas where there's significant changes is just an example from some work in preparation. But this work's already fed into Anna Kerosh's study of climate-smart marine conservation. So if you know what's changing in terms of relevant properties for fisheries, then you can make a climate-resilient protection. So her work's looked at climate change hotspots and bright spots where you can use this information to better protect the marine zone going forwards. So that was a summary of some of the work that connects different animals, and I thought I'd just give you a quick glimpse of what the fronts were doing last year, much the same way Tim did for some of the other properties. So I found July was fairly typical. I called 2001 a fairly typical year back in the day. And so last year, yeah, you can't see much difference between those two maps. But September's a different story. So typically in September, you'd still have very strong frontal features around these tidal mixing fronts and around the upwelling zones. And now either it was very cloudy throughout the month, or there's something gone wrong with my processing of the satellite data, or there was definitely a weakening, I think, of the ocean fronts that probably affected by the weather. But I can't remember, Tim, if there were any storms in September. Not that you've found. So this might be an artifact we're looking at. But yeah, the data's all there. If people want to study relationships between the ocean fronts and various animals, I can point you in the right direction, either myself or through our NEODAS satellite service. So so to summarise, I've tried to highlight some of these connections between the marine life, and fronts seem to be a hotspot of these interactions between the different trophic levels, and can be important for conservation. So thank you.
That's good.